Welcome to Secure Software Development. We're going to begin today by, of course, talking about MySql and passwords. So MySql is the database that I'm sure you're all aware of, and it has a process for securely connecting to a server. MySql is a client-server system. It's a database server, and then clients can connect and access the database. And clients have to authenticate themselves in order to connect. So when entering a password to connect a client to a database, MySql does a series of steps. First, let's create a random message M, just a string of random bytes. Just throw some random bytes out there. And we send that to the client. So the client can't predict that. And observers couldn't predict it. A string of random stuff just goes across the wire. The client goes ahead and hashes the user's password P and obtains what we'll call the stage 1 hash, H1. It then hashes that to obtain the stage 2 hash, H2. Now, the client takes the random message that the server sent it. It takes the stage 2 hash and it combines those two, and it hashes the combination to arrive at the final hash, H. Now, I take that hash, I take the stage 1 hash, and I exclusive OR them together. I can do that, right? They're hashes, assuming we'll use the same hash function that have the same length. So I just straight up exclusive OR the bytes. I'll call the result of that the scramble. And then I send the scramble back to the server. So let's think about this. I hash the password. I hash the result of that a second time. I then combine that with the random bytes that I got from the server, yields a new hash. I then combine that with H1, and I send the result back over. What's the purpose of that message? That message is random, and it prevents a replay attack. It prevents someone who's watching from being able to do pass the hash. Basically record what's being sent and then use that as a proxy for the password later on. So it prevents replay attacks. So on the server side, what happens? Well, the server receives the scramble from the client, and the server goes and gets the stage 2 hash from the password database. So it knows what that is, and it goes and gets it out of the database. Doesn't know the password, but it does know the second stage hash of that password, and so it gets that. The server then hashes the message followed by the stage 2 hash, and that obtains the same H as what we obtained on the client side. The hash is then exclusive OR'd with the scramble. What's happening there? Well, exclusive OR is one of those nice operations that if you do it twice, you undo it. It can easily undo itself. So first I exclusive OR'd the hash with the stage 1 hash to get the scramble. Now if I exclusive OR the hash with the scramble, I get back the stage 1 hash. Great. I'm able to do that because I can compute the hash, because I know the stage 2 hash. And that gives me the stage 1 hash, which I didn't know. The stage 1 hash is hashed a second time, and I obtain a potential stage 2 hash, which should be the same as the one I have stored. Wow, a lot going on there. If the stage 2 hash that I have stored is the same as the stage 2 hash that I get by hashing the stage 1 hash that I got from the scramble, great, I authenticate. Otherwise, I reject. This is a pretty good system. It's got a bunch of moving parts in it. It's a little confusing, but it's actually a pretty good system. I like this. So the code that you see over on the right comes out of password.c, straight out of the MySql code base. And it goes ahead and creates hash stage 2 reassured, and then it compares the two hashes The return value is the result of doing this mem compare. It says mem copy over here, but that's wrong. It's this mem compare at the bottom, and it's cast to a MyBool. Is it? Don't see it cast down here. Oh, look up here at the top. The result of check the scramble is to return a MyBool. So what is a MyBool? If I go and look in the header files, I'll find out it's a sign char. So the memory compare gives me back a result. I cast that to a sign char and return the result of that. Easy peasy. No, nothing too complicated there. We can go through the code real quick if you like. I have a SHA-1 context. This is where I'm going to build the hash. I have a buffer of the hash size, and I have the stage 2 hash reassured of the hash size. As arguments, I get the scramble, I get the random message that I sent, and I get the stage 2 hash that's stored in the database, right? So I know this on the server side because I created it. I know this on the server side because that's what's stored for the user. And I know this on the server side because that's what the client sent me when I sent them the message. So I reset the context, and then I do the hashing, and eventually produce the hash stage 2 reassured, which I'm able to then compare and see if they are the same. The return value that I get back from memCompare, I can go read the man page for that, right? The memCompare function returns an integer less than, equal to, or greater than 0 if the first n bytes of S1 is found respectively to be less than, match, or greater than the first n bytes of S2. So if it's less than, I return an integer less than 0. If it matches, I return 0. If it's greater, I return a number greater than 0. There you go. For a non-zero return value, the sign is determined by the sign of the difference between the first pair of bytes that differ in S1 and S2. If it is 0, the return value is 0, right? If I compare two empty strings, fine, they're the same. So there you go. That's how it's supposed to work. Now, this is all fine and good, but it's a little inefficient, right? Bytes, we're using bytes here. We have SIMD instructions. I can compare multiple bytes at the same time, and why wouldn't I do that? So we can use the same strategy, but what we'll do instead is we'll use 4 bytes, or 32 bits each time, and do the comparison that way. And that's good because it turns out that hash links will divide up nicely into blocks of 4 bytes, and we can just walk over them really fast with the SIMD instructions and do a compare much faster that way. Great. That's how we want to do it. Strings are compared by the SHA-1 hashes. SHA-1 hash is 160 bits long, or 20 bytes, or 40 hexadecimal digits. So again, 20 is divisible by 4, so there you go. Let's compare the two hashes shown at right. So over there at the top, we have, I ask for Szechuan sauce, and I do put that through SHA-1, and I get out that big string there. And I try distant drums, and I put that through SHA-1, and I get out that other hash below it. And you can see they're very different numbers. The first 4 bytes differ? Do they? So clearly those first 4 bytes aren't exactly the same, although the last byte of the first 4 is. So what we do is we grab the first 4 bytes and we do a subtraction and compute the result. And the result of subtracting it is what you see down below it. C905BC00. Why does that matter? Well, the next thing I'm going to do is return that as the return value, because they differ, right? This is not 0, so the memory compare is going to stop here. I'm going to return it, and by returning it, I'm going to inadvertently cast it to a char. Remember? That's that MyBool up at the top. That's going to cast it to a char, which is going to truncate everything off and return 0. And 0 indicates a password match. So Szechuan sauce and distant drums aren't the same password. They don't yield the same hash. but they are the same in that fourth position. So when I do the subtraction and I cast to a byte, I return 0. And the system thinks they match. Oh, that's not good, right? That's going to erroneously indicate a match. And yeah, that's what it does. So because of randomness, think again about how this works. We send a random challenge. The server generates that random message and sends it. Because of that additional randomness, we can expect success for a wrong password about 1 time out of 256. Because there's 256 different possibilities for that fourth byte. And so I'll just try. I don't get in with the first bad password. I'll try the same bad password again. I don't even need to try different passwords. I just try the same one because the variation is coming from the server side. It's providing new random strings. And I can do it with that little loop up above. So you see for I in 0 to 1,000, it's plenty. Do MySql -u root -- password equal bad. Again, I don't care what the password is. And I just run. And eventually I get the MySql prompt. That's not the way it should work. That's not right. There's a link to read about it, and there's a CVE for it. And this one gets a 5.1. Doesn't get a very high score. Again, it's difficult to get a high score in the Olympics of vulnerabilities. But it's still a pretty darn bad vulnerability, especially for something that is remotely internet accessible in most cases. So let's talk about this case study. And to do that, I need to motivate the reason for it. And the reason for it is HIV, human immunodeficiency virus. So about 700,000 Americans have died from HIV since 1981. It's actually difficult to know the correct number. It's always difficult to assign a cause of death for a lot of reasons. Often there will be multiple causes of death, right? The disease isn't necessarily what kills you. It's secondary infections, or it's pneumonia brought about by the disease, or it's heart failure, or it's a number of other things that are caused. If you didn't have the disease, this wouldn't have happened. But that may be recorded as the cause of death, and HIV might not be. So it's difficult to know this. Same thing happened with COVID. COVID killed a lot of people, but sometimes you would say they had COVID and they also had respiratory failure. Well, the respiratory failure, that's what killed them, not COVID. Really? That's not how that works, right? I mean, we recorded it and the reason they had respiratory failure is because they had COVID. Anyway, so more than 1.1 million Americans are currently living with HIV and many more at risk of infection. How do we combat that, right? This is a public health issue. And there's always a risk of resurgence in HIV. We don't want that. So it turns out we have these drugs, a series of drug therapies, antiretrovirals. We've gotten better and better at them over the years. And people who have HIV, who take their HIV medicine as directed by their doctor, maintain a low viral load. The amount of virus that's in their blood that they can communicate to others goes down. And it gets low enough that they cannot pass the disease to an HIV negative partner through sex. So they can't transmit the disease. It gets low enough they just won't transmit it. Right? Getting a single bit of a virus isn't going to give you the disease. You have to get enough of it that it gets a foothold, and before your immune system can deal with it. Getting 1 or 2 disease particles, your immune system is going to take care of that. You have to get enough in to actually trigger the disease. So we can get the viral load low. We won't cure it, but we can prevent you from infecting someone else. And you're going to have a much better life because, again, we've suppressed the virus. In addition, there's pre-exposure prophylaxis that prevents you from getting HIV. And all this is part of the CDC strategy for ending the HIV epidemic. And that's a good goal. The primary goal of this is to achieve two targets. They want to reduce the annual number of new HIV infections by 75% by 2025. That's next year. And they want to reduce the annual number of new HIV infections by 90% by 2030. So if you can get the virus load low enough, you can't transmit the disease. If you get enough people to a state where they can't transmit the disease, then the disease can die out. And that's what we're going for. So the CDC operates this effort on ending the HIV epidemic. And as part of that, they monitor where there are cases. And you can see over there geographic hotspots and regions where there are counties where a lot of new infections tend to be occurring. Right? So you see some states in blue because there are lots of new infections there, and you see some counties that are highlighted in blue. There you go. This is all available to you in a CDC report. They put it out periodically. It takes a while to publish it, so you can't get one typically for the immediately preceding year. You have to wait till the following year to get it. I believe the most recent one at the time I'm doing this is the one from 2022, and it tells you about the status of the surveillance program. And that takes us to data to care. That's a public health strategy that uses HIV surveillance data to identify individuals who are not in care and re-engage them with care, okay, and to support this whole HIV care continuum, right? States can receive funding from the federal government to go do stuff like this, but they have to connect individuals to the care that they need, right? And so they have some data, tells them who has this issue, and they're able to connect them to care. That's what we want. We want them to be in treatment, getting medicine, so that we can get control of this epidemic. The CDC coordinates something called the Routine Interstate Duplicate Review, the RIDR process. What is this? So this is a biannual process where we identify and resolve duplicate cases. Now, what's a duplicate case? Let's suppose that you live in Maryland, but you work in D.C. You might have been diagnosed in Northern Virginia because you went to see a doctor that's close to where you work, and that happens to be across the Potomac in Northern Virginia. You get your health insurance through your employer in D.C., but you live in Maryland. It's a mess, right? How do we know where you are and who should be making sure that you're getting treatment? So we have duplicates, right? Maybe you show up in Maryland's database and you show up in DC's database, and you don't even show up in Virginia's database. Or maybe you don't show up in Maryland's, but you do show up in Virginia. So Maryland doesn't even know that you're living there and you have this issue. So we need a system to correct that, and that's what we do with the RIDR process. We use this enhanced HIV/AIDS reporting system, EHARS, and the idea is that each public health jurisdiction will just pick up the phone and call the other ones, and they will say, if you got a Bob Smith, do you live at this address? Is this a social security number? That's the same one. That's a duplicate. And you'll find people this way, and you'll get them back into treatment. Or you'll discover that they've moved or something else has happened. Doing this is a condition for getting CDC surveillance funds. So, the RIDR process requires two things. It requires personally identifiable information. I have to be able to say, you are this Bob Smith. Not just any Bob Smith, but this particular Bob Smith. And I have to have your protected health information, because I then also have to know what your diagnosis is and other information like that. I have to have both PII and PHI. What information is used? Last name and first name, date of birth, sex assigned at birth, social security number, race, ethnicity, and in addition, we can compute partial social security numbers because sometimes people enter them wrong. They'll enter a 9 as a 6 or do some other mistake. Partial date of birth, same reason. And Soundex versions of your name. What is Soundex? So Soundex is a system that was developed in 1918 and was commonly used in the U.S. Census. It's a way of representing names based on the way they're pronounced so that we can compare them directly through their phonemes as opposed to different spellings, right? You can spell a certain name a dozen different ways. But the Soundex system gives you a way to converge all of those into a set of phonemes, which you can then directly compare. So Soundex is used so that even if someone heard the name and then they entered it, we can compare it. There are many different match levels. There's exact matches where last, first names, date of birth, social security number, birth, sex, and race all match. Extremely high, very high, medium, medium low, low, and very low. Those are different levels of matching, and they're defined this way. So when we say it's a high match, we'll know that the last name and first name and date of birth match, and in addition, your sex at birth or your race also match. So what's the difficulty in this? Well, the challenge is that it's an n-by-n problem. I have to go through my list with you. You have to go through a list with me. And now I've done that with one public health jurisdiction. And there's not 50 of them. There's not one per state. And there's not 51. There's not one per state plus DC. And it's not like a few other territories as well, like Puerto Rico and so on. Sometimes it's particular counties and cities that have their own. Houston has its own. New York, why wouldn't they have their own? Makes sense, right? I mean, New York State and New York City, city of 8 million. LA has its own. There are a lot of public health jurisdictions in the U.S. So going through all of this with every one of them is tedious. Not all records are available at the same time. And so we need to be able to do this matching between pairs of jurisdictions. And ideally what we do, in the ideal case, we put all the data onto one computer. That computer would do the match. Would do the n-by-n matching problem. Figure out what the high matches and the medium high and all that are. And report back the results to each jurisdiction. They would say, here are the ones that match you. This person in West Virginia matches a person in your data set. That's what we would do. That means I have to put a ton of PII and a ton of PHI on a single computer. It's much more risky than the information being at all the individual health jurisdictions because it's scattered throughout the country. This is all of it in one place. Well, that's what we did. We developed a system to do this called the Black Box. It was developed as part of this Avis Terra data analytics system in partnership with Georgetown University. We had a governing body that was brought together from public health jurisdictions, DC, Delaware, Florida, Maryland, North Carolina, New York State, Virginia, West Virginia, and the CDC. We brought everybody together. So we had a governing board. We did all of this with institutional review boards and all of this, and built a system to do this match. If you want to read about that, there's an article that you can go read with lots and lots of authors on here. Michelle Ocampo was the lead. Andre Hamp was on there. He was awesome. My friend Jay Smart's on there. It's a really good bunch of people, and I think did some really good work. The result? Well, in approximately 11 hours, this study matched 290,000 cases from the 800,000 uploaded records. And that included 55,000 exact matches. And that's great. Top overlaps were New York City and New York State. No big surprise there, right? 51% of those. Turns out, you might be in both those databases. DC and Maryland, Florida and New York City, which is kind of wild. And Florida and New York State. It's kind of wild what's going on there. So Jurisdictions estimated that they realized a combined 135 labor hours in time efficiency by using this approach. So why did it take 11 hours? Well, because not everybody uploaded the data at the same time, and data was matched as it was uploaded. So you would connect, upload your data, system would then match what it had, and do that partial piece of the matching. Someone else would upload the data, we do some partial matching of that, etc. Sensitive data. Due to the privacy-centered engineering design and technical approach of this study, which prohibits any person from seeing the data once in the black box system and disallows long-term permanent storage of data, the Georgetown University Institutional Review Board determined that the study was exempt from review. We had tons of PHI, tons of PII, and we were able to successfully argue that because of the way we architected the system, we were exempt from review. That's absolutely astonishing to me. Still to this day, astonishing. So what did we do? We built a system that was secure by design. I'm going to describe how we did that. Is it perfectly secure? Is it hacker-proof? Right, come at me, bro. It's the best we could make it. I think you'll see what we did. Is there stuff I don't know? Sure, right? I mean, of course. But it's the best we could do. The black box is a secure by design architecture for data sharing and analytics, and we had a design focus, and the design focus was clear. Minimize the attack surface. If we don't need it, it's not in there. Minimize the attack surface. Nothing extraneous. Why are you putting that in there? Don't put that in there. Minimize the attack surface. Failure mode. So one permitted failure mode, and that is destroying all the data. All right? We have all this data in here. Something goes wrong. Well, fine. We'll just destroy the data. We'll just erase all the data. And that's okay, right? The jurisdictions have their data. They've got it on their side backed up, and so we can restart and re-upload the data. We had to build this using existing protocols, right? Because we had to use standards like FIPS 140, which is the standard for encryption. And we had to say we're using existing standard protocols. We're not inventing new protocols that may be subject to security problems. So minimize the attack surface. Data destruction. Keep those things in mind. So what did we do? Well, we used a combination of physical, network, and security design elements, and severe restrictions on installed software and capabilities. That's how we did the minimizing of the attack surface. Secure defaults. We made sure the system, when it booted up, went into a verified secure state. And we made sure we failed securely, right? Failure results in data destruction. Remember, these are the three principles that we encountered when we talked about what we need to do when we develop software. Minimize the attack surface, have secure defaults, and fail security. Cover those basics, and you've got most of the work done. Cover those basics. In addition, we wanted to protect the data, so we had a separation of duties. The system was physically divided into nodes that have specific responsibility assignments. Least privileges. No person or software had read or write access to all the data, except for the internal data transfer and then vetted analysis code. And we'll talk about that in a few moments. I could not get access to the data while the system was running. Lab staff, IT people, system administrators could not get access to the data while the system was running. That was really important. Defense in depth. Each layer of the system has independent security measures, and zero trust. Components of the system do not trust each other. They require authentication, and they rely on static authorization. We'll cover a little bit of that in a moment. The use case? An external health jurisdiction, like let's say Miami, requests a connection to the black box. So they do that. They say, I want to connect to the black box. And they do that by port knocking. All the ports of the black box are closed. No open ports. So what they do is they port knock. What is a port? A port is just a number. It's a number that's part of a packet. And all the packets that come in go through the network card and go to the kernel, and the kernel looks at the port number and says, does anyone want this? If no one wants it, it throws it on the floor. But because they make their way through, you can also look at those numbers and see what the sequence of numbers is and figure out if someone is trying to connect. And in this case, we look for a specific sequence of numbers and say, oh, that sequence of numbers belongs to Miami. Miami wants to connect. So what do? Do we open up ports? No, we don't. What we do is we look up Miami's IP address, their known endpoint, and we, from the black box, launch a connection to that known endpoint. So let's say that you're someone, you want to spoof being Miami. So you do the port knock. We're then going to connect to the known Miami endpoint, regardless of what you did. So we open an encrypted tunnel using SSH, and we do all the authentication for that tunnel. The jurisdiction then opens an SFTP connection back across that same tunnel into the black box. They're able to do that because we established that tunnel first. So even though all the ports are closed, they can still get a connection back into the system across that established tunnel. And again, we do all the authentication for that second tunnel as well. Then they can exchange keys and data, and we can run the message. So here are the requirements we had for the system. We required that no sensitive data was ever permanently stored or written to non-volatile storage. How do you prevent data from being written to a hard drive or an SSD? How do you prevent it? We prevented it by not having any hard drives or SSDs. The systems, when they're booted up, build RAM drives. We have terabytes of DRAM, very expensive, but that means that there is no permanent storage. So the DRAM sits there. We build a RAM disk in it. We actually build an encrypted RAM disk in it. The encryption key for that encrypted RAM disk is itself stored in DRAM. So if power is lost, you get memory corruption in the DRAM, which means you probably lost the encryption key for the entire drive. And so you've lost the data. No single party owns all the keys used, right? So one of the hard things to think about in this effort is there are tons of keys being used. There's a key used to authenticate the jurisdiction with the black box, one used to authenticate the black box with the jurisdiction. These are pairs of keys, and others as well. There's host keys in both directions, etc. When the black box starts up, it creates virtual keys for everybody, and the private key is always kept on the black box. It's never been out of the black box. It's not accessible. The way that the jurisdiction gets the public part of that key to use is that they connect and download it. And they're able to do that using a set of keys that allow them to do key exchange. Once they have that volatile key, they can use that volatile key for data exchange. So data exchange requires the volatile key, which is the private keys, only ever stored in the black box in DRAM, which will be erased when the machine is turned off, or at least corrupted when the machine is turned off. Endpoints for all data transfers are well known and are defined in advance. Data destruction is desirable failure mode. Data is doubly encrypted in transit, right? It's across two channels, two SSH channels. And it's encrypted at rest. It's an encrypted RAM drive. Hardware is inaccessible while sensitive data is stored. And we'll cover that in just a moment. So here's the basic outline. So the jurisdictions are over on the left there. They connect to the internet of cat videos and porn. and send their data to the external IP address of the national lab. From there, it works its way over a dedicated connection to the knowledge discovery infrastructure, KDI, and goes through our firewall and then connects into the specific cabinet and to a dedicated network interface card. We actually had dedicated cards for each one of these connections onto the external node. Now, the cabinet itself is interesting. The cabinet has a power interlock. If I try to get into the cabinet, I break a connection which kills power. We did that using reed switches, and we just kill power to the entire cabinet. So how do you turn the system on? The system is set up so that when power is supplied, everything boots up. So the way you do it is you get things set up and you close the cabinet. And when you close the cabinet, everything powers on. It's really kind of a neat way to do things. How do you get access to it? Well, you have to get into the lab. So you have to drive through the gate, and there are guards with guns at the gate. You have to get into building 5700. Okay, that's badged access. Maybe you can slip in past someone. You have to get up to the second floor and get to the one of the computing center rooms. That's restricted access. You have to have computing center access to get in there, and that's pretty tightly controlled, and it's monitored. Once you get in there, how do you get into the cage where this machine is stored? To get there, you have to have somebody who has a key to that cage. You have to get someone from lab staff to come with you and unlock that and stay with you the entire time you're there so they can lock it when you leave. Can't be in there by yourself. And under the protocols of this project, I had to have someone else with them. Each one of us had to have someone else in the project with us when we did it. We'll cover that in a minute. Once you're in there, there's the cabinet that actually has the gear in it. If you open that, you kill power. So very, very challenging to get physical access to this. And again, the whole thing's on camera, monitored 24/7. So we had physical protections, and I just covered a lot of that. We have logical ones. Traffic is filtered at the Oak Ridge Border Gateway. Traffic with the black box is filtered to known endpoints. There's no reason to pass along traffic that doesn't come from a known endpoint, because why would you? Or go to a known endpoint. All connections originate outbound. All incoming ports in the system are closed. All data is doubly encrypted in motion, and all data is encrypted at rest. No accounts have a shell configured. And I mean that. No accounts have a shell configured. There's not a shell configured for root. It turns out you can boot up a Linux system without root having a shell. You go into the password file and you set the shell to dev null and you're done. And that will work just fine, weirdly enough. All connections are restricted to SFTP. When you come in remotely, you're only allowed to connect using SFTP. You're not allowed to connect using SSH because you can't run a shell. And so we just don't have the shells on the machine. All connections are to a root jail, which means that once you've connected using SFTP, you can't CD up because it looks to you like you're sitting in root and you're locked in root. All data arrives on the external node where it is scanned, and non-conforming data is deleted. We have, remember that EHARS format? We have a piece of software that has had proofs done on it, proofs of correctness, that checks to be sure that the data we receive conforms to the EHARS standard exactly. Fields are whatever the maximum length is. Everything fits this format perfectly. If it doesn't, if fields are too long or something else is weird, we throw it away. All past data arrives at the compute node where it's scanned and non-conforming data is deleted. So again, if it doesn't match that exact EHARS format, we throw it away. Within the system, all connections are fixed IP and they are directly wired. There are dedicated cards for every connection. So literally dedicated cards. There's not a switch in the cabinet. It's wired directly one to another. The matching code was formally verified. So communication looks like I said earlier, right? The client generates its own key pair. So the client, there's some software that runs on the client side, and when they start it up, they're able to generate a key pair. And now they have to exchange keys with the black box. So they've got a persistent key that lets them exchange keys, and they connect to us with the port knock, and that's all they can do. They just throw a port knock off into the ether. That causes the external system to pre-position data for them and then initiate an SSH tunnel. The client has to be running an SSH server to receive that tunnel. There's an authentication phase, both authenticating the client and authenticating the machine the client is on, authenticating the machine the black box is on, right? Host keys go in both directions. Everything gets authenticated. Then they do an SFTP connection bound to the black box. And again, full authentication, host authentication in both directions, everything gets done. Finally, I can exchange keys. Let's say I can send up the key the client generated, and I can receive the public key that the black box generated. And once I have those, I would then use those keys the next time, and that enables me to transmit data. Then I terminate the connection, and things get put away, and everything is good. So that's how the exchange works. Protections, lots of protections in here. Physical protections, in a secure environment, power interlock on the cabinet, sensitive data is encrypted, never stored to an SSD or to a drive. It's always in volatile memory. Network interfaces are highly restricted. Modifications to software and hardware are subject to a two-person rule. Typically, that was Jeff Nichols and me. We had to be there together. We had to observe what was going on, agree, yes, it's what we should do, then you could do it. All support and analysis software was reviewed and approved by 3 people prior to installation. So we had to be typically the 3 of us who were at the lab working on this. We had to agree this is correct, and then we could do it. Network protections, no open ports. Data transfers are encrypted. Outgoing connections are permitted only to known and defined hosts, and authentication is done by 4096-bit per client keys. And one set of keys is purely volatile. We can't even get that, and it's destroyed when the system is down. So those keys are lost. Internally, the external node of the black box does not permit any user to run an interactive shell. And it itself, the external node, is treated as untrusted by the compute node. So the black box is not able to send data to any other node. It can't do that. All the ports for the compute node, for example, are closed, except for an outgoing port 22. So compute can connect to the black box over a dedicated wire to a particular interface that's allowed to connect on. And when it does that, they do this whole authentication thing, then the compute node can suck up data from the external node, and it deletes it off the external node, moves it to the compute node where it is checked, and then the match is performed, and then the compute node moves that data back and positions it on the external node. Connections are restricted to a root jail. Input data does not remain on the external node, it's moved. And external compute nodes have no persistent storage. Software running on the black box is whitelisted, and a self-check is done at boot. We'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to say the following. There's no spinning drives. There's no SSDs in this. How do we get the operating system on here? Well, we have to download it when the thing boots up. And we need it to be small, so that happens quickly. The way that's done is we took one of those build your own Linux systems. So building an embedded Linux means you can often pull a bunch of stuff out of it. And we had students at Tennessee Tech figure out just how much of the OS they could strip away before things quit working. And they did that, and then they put some stuff back, and they stripped more stuff away, and they played this game until they pared it down to the bare minimum you had to have in order to do the stuff we wanted to do. There was no antivirus or any malware or logging of any kind on this system. All those things had vulnerabilities. None of that stuff was on here. We stripped it down, minimize the attack surface. We don't need a piece of software. We don't have it, right? Get to the very minimum you need to just make the thing work. It was great to like boot it all up and do a process listing and see like nothing is running. It's great. So all components treat the data as raw text. Everything gets validated before transfer. It gets validated after transfer. It gets validated when the client gets it back. When the client has retrieved the data, it validates it, and it erases it if it fails validation. How do we protect the client? The black box has all this fancy protection, but what about the client sitting in, let's say, Miami? Well, the client's subject to jurisdiction where it is, so it has to conform to all their rules. The client itself has to have endpoint protection software installed. You can turn it off. You can turn the computer you use off. It's just off. So, you can't get remote access to it now because it's off. And ultimately what we did was deploy this stuff on data thumbs. So the key, the persistent key, and the software is on a data thumb. So you would turn the computer on, you put the data thumb in, you'd run the transfer stuff, and then when you're done, you unplug the data thumb, lock it away, power the machine off. Client's pretty secure. We completed the initial process, the project, and we shipped the thing to Georgetown, and I think it's probably still in use right now. There's the cabinet we used. You can see we put up a barrier there with this fancy logos on it so that you couldn't fish cables out from underneath it. And there's Jeff Nichols doing his best to try to debug problems. Debugging this thing was nearly impossible. What you have to do is build two systems, one of which you can access and one of which is locked away in a way that makes it nearly impossible to get access to. We did a threat model for this. I can't show you all details of the threat model because that exposes information about the lab, but I can tell you a little bit about the high-level threat model. The protections we saw were mitigations for threats that we identified by doing threat modeling on the black box. And we had several different potential threat actors. We had remote nation-state level actors. We wanted to defend this against remote nation-state level actors. Potential privileged insiders within IT. Physical intruders, people who can get physical access to the system. We wanted to protect against them. Unwitting threat actors, right? People who are being socially engineered. And malicious project members. I, as the PI of the project, could be a threat actor. And we had to develop the system in such a way that it protects against me being compromised and trying to subvert it. So the threat model included the possibility of a compromised remote client as well. Threat models are privileged artifacts, and so you don't necessarily get the full details of it, but we can tell you a little bit about it. So here's that architecture, just in a different form. Participating jurisdictions, the internet of cat videos and porn, various switches along the way until we arrive at the external node, the compute node, and the management node. I haven't talked about the management node, but this is a good time to bring it up. If the external and compute nodes have no storage, where is the operating system stored and how do they boot? Well, they boot off of the management node. When the system powers on, the external node and the compute node power up and they look for someone to pixie boot them, to serve them over the network some stuff to boot. The management node actually has storage. And so when it boots up, it is able to provide the image for the external node and the image for the compute node. Once the external node connects and gets it, and the compute node connects and gets it, and they boot, they each send notification to the management node, hey, I'm booted. I'm up and running. Once the management node has received that signal from both of them, it shuts down and powers off. So once you close the cabinet, you can watch all the machines come on, hear the fans come on, and you can watch for the external node, for the management node to power off. When it powers off, and you hear its fan die, you know the system is up and running. And that's the only way you know, because there's no other way to get access to it. So, we have medical records in the EHARS format coming over an SSH tunnel over another SSH tunnel. And internally, we have medical records flowing over an SSH tunnel in the EHARS format. That's what we have moving around that we want to protect. So we have some possible threats. A participating jurisdiction might send us corrupted data. How do we deal with that? Well, again, we do this scanning of the data and we throw it away if it doesn't conform correctly. A participating jurisdiction is compromised and sends us malware. We don't execute any of that stuff, right? The first thing we do is we scan that to be sure that it's in the EHARS format, which is not an executable format. An intermediate actor intercepts traffic. That's the person in the middle. They could do that by BGP poisoning or ARP poisoning or DNS poisoning. That's a potential threat. Okay? So I do the port knock, but I also trick the internet into routing the traffic to me. So looks like I have the IP address that you're trying to get to. So I get the traffic. It's okay because we do all of this authentication stuff along the way to be sure that we're talking to the correct jurisdiction. Another project in the data center results in a network compromise. Well, we had our own connection. We had our own connection straight all the way out, our own piece of fiber running there. So if that was compromised or the Oak Ridge physical network was compromised, we were still isolated. And we had all the other protections, right? Ports are closed, etc. An error on the external node passes corrupted data to the compute node. Again, the compute node checks the data as well, so it would throw it away at that point. An error on the compute node passes corrupted data to external node. It checks it again, and the client checks it. So either one of those would throw it away. We had a separate machine off the network sitting in my office at the lab, and that was the build computer. And that's the one we used to build the images that the management node passed to the external compute node. It was sitting in my office, but Jeff Nichols is the one who knew the password to it, and we would get together and we would build these together before we were able to install them. So we had a two-person rule for that. An insider might install a compromised image on the management node. Again, that requires that they physically access the management node because it's not wired to the internet. The only node that has a connection that goes out to the internet is the external node. So, right, we put these on data thumbs, stuck them in the back of the management node, verified that's what we did, and that's how the stuff got on there. And Jeff and I had to agree on that. The client might generate weak cryptographic keys. We didn't let them. We actually, as part of the client that we produced and sent to them, we wrote the software that generates the keys, and it generates 4096-bit RSA keys. The client's network could be compromised? Sure, absolutely could be. Absolutely could be. So the protections have to then be upstream of the client. An intruder attempts to fish out a network cable and splice it. What am I talking about here? You get down on the floor of the room and you get a little hook and you reach underneath the cabinet and you try to hook one of the cables and pull it out and splice it. So what we did was we had people cut the cables to length and put them in. So the cables are all like straight to length. So it's not like cables hanging down. They're cut to the length they need to be just to make that connection. And we moved all the blades up so they're up high in the middle of the cabinet, so you can't get access to it. An intruder attempts to, an incorrect algorithm on the compute node exposes information. Again, the compute node is buried in the middle of the cabinet, doesn't have an external connection, and the information it would expose would be through the matching, and so it would go out to the health jurisdictions. And, ultimately, they are responsible for that data. So we're sending data to people who are responsible for it. So that's the black box. There's homework due 12 November. The homework is on differential privacy. This is going to go back. We're going to look at that differential privacy work that you did, and you're going to modify your code to allow setting upper and lower bounds along with the privacy metric, right? The privacy budget. What you'll do is you'll have epsilon be set as a constant in your program. Now, the lower and upper bounds can be set as constants, or you can compute them from the data range. But the point is, they are different from the upper and lower bounds given on the command line. So the ones on the command line are used to filter the data. The upper and lower bounds used to compute the differential privacy are distinct from those. Now, a question you should ask is, are there good approaches for choosing the upper and lower bounds for differential privacy? Propose and implement any such method and include comments in your code to explain it. Now, if you use the differential privacy library and it chooses those for you, explain how it chooses them. I want you to know how those get chosen. Include an explanation of why it's a bad idea to let the analyst choose the bounds. And that's what we did the first time. And we agreed that was a bad thing. Why was it a bad thing? Okay. All this can be in commentary in your code. That's it.